Hi guys, today we are going to find out what if Hurricane Katrina had never hit New Orleans. You're standing in the French Quarter on August 29th, 2005, watching tourists sip their morning café au lait. The air feels heavy with typical summer humidity, but there's no panic, no boarding up windows. Weather reports show Katrina weakening dramatically as it approaches the Gulf Coast, veering eastward toward Mississippi instead. You probably won't survive this alternate timeline without questioning everything you thought you knew about American resilience. The storm that should have been a Category 3 monster fizzles to a Category 1, barely grazing Louisiana. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Street musicians continue their sets on Royal Street, unaware they just avoided losing everything. The levees hold because they're never truly tested by the storm surge that never comes. Families in the lower Ninth Ward go about their Sunday routines, children playing in yards. Emergency shelters remain empty, and the Superdome hosts its usual events instead of becoming a symbol. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where this story reaches. Mayor Ray Nagin breathes a sigh of relief as meteorologists downgrade the threat. Now, sit back and let's dive into today's alternate journey together. You watch as America dodges what would have been one of its greatest natural disasters. You watch as the city's population of nearly 500,000 people simply stays put that Monday morning. School buses that should have been evacuating residents instead follow their normal routes to pick up children. The Superdome parking lot fills with regular Saints fans discussing the upcoming season, not evacuees clutching belongings. Hospital patients remain in their beds receiving routine care instead of facing life-or-death emergency transfers. You notice how the city's most vulnerable residents, the elderly, disabled, and poor, continue their daily routines uninterrupted. Nursing homes maintain their regular schedules, with residents playing bingo instead of being hastily relocated. The iconic streetcars keep running their usual routes through the Garden District and French Quarter. Restaurants stay open, serving their famous gumbo to tourists who never had to cancel their vacations. You observe families in Gentilly and New Orleans East going about their Sunday evening preparations for the work week. Children sleep peacefully in their own beds instead of on cots in distant cities. The massive logistical nightmare of evacuating a major American city simply never materializes. Churches hold their regular Sunday evening services instead of becoming emergency shelters. You realize that nearly 1.3 million people who historically fled the region simply stay home. The largest peacetime evacuation in American history becomes just another avoided weather event. Gas stations report normal traffic instead of the panic buying that creates massive traffic jams. You stroll through the French Quarter on Labor Day weekend, watching street performers entertain crowds that never had to evacuate. The iconic Jackson Square remains filled with artists sketching portraits and fortune tellers reading palms for uninterrupted tourists. Bourbon Street maintains its steady rhythm of jazz clubs, restaurants, and souvenir shops generating millions in revenue. You notice how hotel occupancy rates stay at their typical late summer levels instead of plummeting to zero. Convention centers host scheduled business meetings and trade shows that historically would have been canceled for months. The riverboat casinos continue their regular operations along the Mississippi, never becoming emergency housing. Tour guides lead their usual ghost walks and cemetery visits, sharing local legends instead of recent tragedy stories. You observe cruise ships docking on schedule, bringing thousands of passengers who spend freely in local shops. Restaurant workers keep their jobs serving traditional Creole and Cajun cuisine to visitors who never stopped coming. The economy that should have lost billions in tourism revenue simply continues its normal seasonal patterns. Street vendors sell their handmade crafts and local artwork without the disruption of mass displacement. You realize that New Orleans' reputation as America's most unique cultural destination remains unmarked by recent disaster. Wedding planners continue booking elaborate celebrations in historic mansions and garden venues. The hospitality industry never faces the challenge of rebuilding guest confidence in the city's safety. Jazz funerals remain cultural celebrations rather than symbols of a city's rebirth after tragedy. You follow the musicians of New Orleans as they continue their careers without losing instruments, homes, or hope. The legendary Preservation Hall maintains its nightly concerts, with the same elderly jazz masters who never had to flee. You watch Wynton Marsalis perform at the Jazz and Heritage Festival that spring, uninterrupted by reconstruction concerns. Local brass bands keep their regular gig schedules at weddings, funerals, and neighborhood celebrations throughout the city. The Trem's musical heritage continues its unbroken chain, with families passing down traditions in their original homes. You observe how recording studios like C. Saint and Cosimo's maintain their operations, capturing local talent continuously. Musicians who historically would have scattered to Houston, Atlanta, and beyond simply stay put in their musical community. The New Orleans Jazz Orchestra continues its educational programs, teaching young people in neighborhoods that stay intact. You notice how the city's unique musical ecosystem, from street corners to concert halls, never faces disruption. Second-line parades continue their traditional Sunday routes through neighborhoods that never empty out. The French Quarter Festival proceeds as planned, with local musicians earning steady income from regular performances. Music venues like Tipitina's and House of Blues maintain their regular booking schedules without reconstruction delays. You realize that the distinctive New Orleans sound continues evolving naturally instead of being shaped by trauma and displacement. Young musicians learn directly from masters who never had to relocate or rebuild their lives elsewhere. The city's musical soul remains continuous, never experiencing the forced pause that historically reshaped its identity. You enter the halls of power where politicians never face the scrutiny that a major disaster would have brought. President Bush continues his August vacation at his Crawford Ranch, never needing to cut it short for emergency management. FEMA Director Michael Brown keeps his job, never becoming the face of federal disaster response failure. You watch as Congress avoids the heated hearings about government preparedness that historically reshaped emergency policy. The Department of Homeland Security never faces questions about its ability to coordinate massive relief efforts. Local politicians like Mayor Ray Nagin and Governor Kathleen Blanco continue their normal approval ratings without crisis management tests. You observe how federal agencies maintain their existing budgets instead of receiving emergency disaster appropriations. The National Guard units from Louisiana never deploy for rescue operations, staying available for overseas missions. Political careers that should have ended in disgrace simply continue along their predicted trajectories. You notice how emergency management protocols remain theoretical rather than being stress-tested by reality. The Coast Guard maintains its regular duties instead of conducting the largest rescue operation in its history. Congressional investigations into levee maintenance and flood protection never materialize, leaving accountability gaps unfilled. You realize that the political lessons about federal disaster response simply go unlearned for years longer. Campaign promises about infrastructure investment lack the urgency that a recent catastrophe would have provided. The cozy relationships between politicians and contractors continue undisturbed by post-disaster oversight requirements. You walk into the boardrooms of insurance companies where executives celebrate avoiding the largest payout in American history. State Farm, Allstate, and other major insurers never face the $80 billion in claims that would have bankrupted some smaller companies. You observe how flood insurance policies through the National Flood Insurance Program remain comfortably underfunded and actuarially unsound. Homeowners in vulnerable areas continue paying relatively low premiums, never learning the true cost of their risk. Insurance executives avoid congressional hearings about denying legitimate claims during a mass disaster event. You notice how coastal development continues unchecked, with insurers still willing to write policies in high-risk areas. The complex legal battles between wind damage and flood damage coverage simply never arise for thousands of policyholders. Adjusters maintain their normal caseloads instead of being overwhelmed by catastrophic claims requiring immediate attention. You watch as insurance companies' stock prices remain stable, never experiencing the massive drops from unprecedented payouts. The reinsurance market continues its regular operations without the shock that would have reshaped global risk assessment. Insurance fraud investigators handle routine cases instead of processing thousands of suspicious disaster-related claims. You realize that the actuarial models predicting hurricane damage remain theoretical rather than being brutally tested by reality. Coastal property values stay artificially high because the true insurance costs of living in flood zones aren't revealed. The insurance industry's vulnerability to climate-related disasters remains hidden for several more years. Risk management becomes a comfortable academic exercise rather than an urgent survival necessity for the industry. You examine the Army Corps of Engineers' New Orleans office where the fatal flaws in the levee system remain hidden. The 17th Street Canal levee continues its normal operations, never revealing the design defects that would have caused catastrophic failure. Engineers conduct routine inspections without the urgent scrutiny that a major breach would have triggered across the system. You watch as the industrial canal maintains its regular shipping traffic, its walls never tested by unprecedented storm surge. The London Avenue Canal operates normally, with residents nearby never learning how close they live to potential disaster. Soil subsidence continues gradually weakening foundations, while engineers focus on routine maintenance rather than systemic overhauls. You observe how federal funding for levee improvements remains at minimal levels without the political pressure disaster brings. The complex interaction between human-made canals and natural waterways continues developing problems that stay unnoticed. Environmental groups raise occasional concerns about wetland loss, but their warnings lack the urgency of post-disaster advocacy. You realize that the engineering community misses crucial lessons about storm surge dynamics and levee failure modes. Hurricane protection systems throughout the Gulf Coast remain similarly vulnerable, never receiving the comprehensive review a major failure would trigger. The Corps maintains its traditional approach to flood control without incorporating lessons from near-catastrophic system failure. You notice how the technical knowledge gained from analyzing massive levee breaches simply doesn't enter engineering practice. Coastal communities from Texas to Florida continue relying on similarly outdated flood protection infrastructure. The scientific understanding of how complex levee systems fail under extreme conditions advances much more slowly. You walk through the lower Ninth Ward, where families continue living in the same houses their grandparents built. The historic Creole cottages and shotgun houses maintain their original residence, preserving generations of neighborhood knowledge. You observe how local businesses like corner stores and barbershops keep serving the same customers without interruption. The Holy Cross neighborhood maintains its tight-knit community bonds that disaster and displacement would have shattered. Children attend the same schools their parents graduated from, continuing educational traditions within stable family structures. You notice how elderly residents remain in their homes, avoiding the trauma of forced relocation to unfamiliar cities. The Ninth Ward's unique African-American cultural traditions continue passing from elders to youth in unbroken chains. Local churches maintain their congregations, serving as community anchors that never face the challenge of rebuilding from scratch. You watch as neighborhood social networks stay intact, with residents knowing their neighbors across multiple generations. The area's distinctive architecture remains unchanged, preserving the visual character that defines this historic community. Small family-owned businesses continue operating from the same locations, maintaining economic stability within the neighborhood. You realize that the complex web of kinship ties and social relationships never experiences the devastating disruption of mass displacement. Community gardens and informal gathering spaces continue fostering daily interactions that build social cohesion. The neighborhood's oral history traditions remain unbroken, with stories and memories staying within their geographical context. Cultural practices like second-line parades and block parties continue strengthening community identity without forced interruption. You enter the bustling port of New Orleans, where cargo operations continue without the massive disruption that would have crippled global trade. The Mississippi River maintains its regular shipping traffic, with grain exports and container ships moving billions in commerce uninterrupted. Oil refineries along the Gulf Coast keep producing at full capacity, avoiding the fuel shortages that would have spiked gas prices nationwide. You observe how the petrochemical industry continues its normal operations without the environmental disasters that major flooding would have triggered. Tourism revenue, streams from hotels, restaurants, and attractions never experience the devastating losses requiring years of recovery. The convention business maintains its regular booking schedule, hosting major trade shows and conferences as planned. You watch as local unemployment rates stay at normal levels instead of skyrocketing due to business closures and evacuations. Small businesses from corner markets to specialty shops avoid the crushing financial burden of rebuilding from total destruction. The fishing industry continues harvesting Gulf seafood without contamination concerns from flooded industrial sites and chemical spills. You notice how the region's agricultural sector maintains steady production, avoiding crop losses that would have affected food prices. Insurance companies pay normal claims rather than facing bankruptcy from unprecedented property damage payouts. The construction industry handles routine projects instead of being overwhelmed by massive reconstruction demands, driving up labor costs. You realize that supply chains serving the entire southeastern United States never experienced the disruption that would have created shortages. Energy infrastructure remains intact, avoiding blackouts and fuel distribution problems that would have affected neighboring states. The economic multiplier effects that should have devastated Louisiana's economy simply never materialize across the region. You observe the demographic patterns of New Orleans as the city's population continues its gradual, natural changes instead of sudden displacement. The African-American majority in Orleans Parish maintains its historical presence without the massive exodus that would have scattered families nationwide. You watch as young professionals continue their slow but steady migration to suburbs like Jefferson Parish and Saint-Tammany. The city's age distribution remains stable, with elderly residents aging in place rather than being forced into distant nursing homes. Gentrification proceeds at its normal pace in neighborhoods like the Marigny and Bywater, without the accelerated development that post-disaster rebuilding creates. You notice how income inequality grows gradually through typical economic forces, rather than being dramatically reshaped by disaster recovery patterns. The student population at Tulane, Loyola, and other universities follows predictable enrollment trends without major disruptions. Housing patterns evolve slowly, with families making deliberate choices about where to live rather than emergency relocations. You realize that the city's unique cultural mix continues blending naturally instead of being artificially preserved through disaster solidarity. Migration flows between New Orleans and other southern cities maintain their historical patterns without crisis-driven spikes. The brain drain of educated professionals happens gradually rather than in the sudden exodus that typically follows major disasters. You observe how neighborhood social hierarchies remain intact, continuing their complex evolution without the leveling effect of shared trauma. Family structures stay stable, with multiple generations living in proximity rather than being separated by emergency relocations. The city's population density decreases slowly through normal urban sprawl rather than sudden abandonment of flood-prone areas. Political representation maintains existing patterns without the demographic shifts that would have altered voting constituencies and power structures. You enter the world of climate science where Hurricane Katrina's absence allows skepticism and denial to flourish unchecked. Politicians continue dismissing global warming as a distant threat without the visceral proof that a climate-enhanced superstorm provides. You watch as oil industry lobbyists maintain their influence over environmental policy without facing public outrage from a recent disaster. Climate change documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth gain less traction without the stark visual evidence of New Orleans underwater. The scientific community struggles to communicate hurricane intensification risks when the most dramatic example never occurred. You observe how coastal development continues at breakneck pace without the sobering reality check of recent catastrophic flooding. Insurance companies avoid raising premiums based on climate projections, lacking the recent precedent of massive weather-related losses. Environmental groups find their warnings about sea level rise and storm surge falling on deaf ears among policymakers. You notice how the federal government delays investments in climate adaptation infrastructure by several more years. Carbon emission reduction policies face stronger resistance without the emotional weight of a recent climate disaster. The Paris Climate Agreement negotiations proceed with less urgency from American delegates who haven't witnessed domestic climate impacts. You realize that hurricane research funding remains at lower levels without the pressing need to understand what went wrong. Coastal communities from Miami to Houston continue building as if extreme weather events are manageable rather than existential threats. The psychological distance between climate change and everyday Americans stays comfortably wide without a recent national trauma. Storm surge modeling and hurricane prediction technology advance more slowly without the urgent need for post-disaster improvements. You stand at the edge of the Gulf Coast as meteorologists track the next major hurricane system forming in the Atlantic. The city's emergency management plans remain largely the same flawed documents that would have failed during Katrina. You watch weather forecasters issue warnings to a population that has never experienced the terror of a truly catastrophic storm. The levee system continues operating with the same structural weaknesses, now several years older and more deteriorated. Evacuation routes remain inadequately planned, never having been tested by the massive traffic jams that a real emergency creates. You observe how emergency shelters maintain their insufficient capacity, never expanding after learning from an actual disaster. The National Hurricane Center issues its predictions to officials who have never managed a true catastrophe. Residents debate whether to evacuate based on theoretical knowledge rather than the painful memory of recent devastation. You notice how the media coverage lacks the urgency that comes from reporting on a city that has already drowned once. Emergency supplies in stores run low as people make last-minute preparations without the efficiency that disaster experience teaches. The psychological preparedness of the population remains dangerously optimistic, having never lived through genuine catastrophe. You realize that all the vulnerable people who should have learned they lived in deadly flood zones simply don't know. Hospitals continue their standard emergency protocols without the hard-won knowledge of how to handle mass casualties during flooding. The coordination between federal, state, and local agencies remains untested, still vulnerable to the communication breakdowns that historically proved fatal. Hurricane season arrives with the same false confidence that has historically preceded America's worst natural disasters. You venture into the neighborhoods where systemic inequality continues festering without the harsh spotlight that disaster brings to social problems. The lower Ninth Ward's substandard housing conditions remain largely invisible to national media and policymakers. You observe how racial disparities in emergency preparedness stay hidden, with vulnerable communities lacking resources for evacuation or disaster supplies. Educational inequalities persist in underfunded schools that never receive the attention and resources that post-disaster rebuilding often provides. Healthcare access problems continue affecting low-income residents without the federal intervention that major disasters typically trigger. You notice how environmental justice issues remain buried, with poor communities still bearing disproportionate pollution burdens. The digital divide keeps isolating elderly and low-income residents from emergency information systems that could save lives. Food deserts in certain neighborhoods continue limiting access to nutrition without the grocery store rebuilding that follows disasters. You watch as transportation inequities persist, leaving residents without cars particularly vulnerable to future evacuation orders. Housing discrimination continues through subtle practices that never face the scrutiny of post-disaster fair housing enforcement. Mental health services remain underfunded and inaccessible to communities that need them most during future crises. You realize that the social safety net's weaknesses stay concealed until the next major test reveals them catastrophically. Community organizing efforts lack the urgency and resources that shared trauma typically brings to grassroots movements. The geographic concentration of poverty in flood-prone areas continues unchallenged by evidence of its deadly consequences. Political attention remains focused elsewhere, allowing structural inequalities to deepen without intervention or national awareness. You witness communities throughout the Gulf Coast missing the critical opportunity to build genuine disaster resilience and preparedness. Emergency response training programs remain theoretical exercises rather than being refined through the harsh lessons of actual catastrophe. You observe how neighborhood mutual aid networks never develop the strength that comes from surviving shared hardship together. Building codes continue allowing construction practices that would prove deadly during major flooding events. The culture of disaster preparedness stays weak, with families maintaining minimal emergency supplies and evacuation plans. You notice how social cohesion remains untested, never developing the deep bonds that communities forge through collective survival. Early warning systems maintain their basic functionality without the upgrades that post-disaster analysis typically demands. Community leadership structures stay unchanged, never identifying the natural organizers who emerge during genuine crises. You watch as volunteer organizations maintain their routine charitable activities without developing the rapid response capabilities that disasters create. The psychological resilience that comes from surviving and recovering from trauma simply never develops in the population. Interfaith cooperation remains at normal levels instead of deepening through the shared mission of helping disaster survivors. You realize that the innovative spirit that emerges from rebuilding communities from scratch never gets unleashed. Neighborhood watch programs continue their standard crime prevention focus without expanding into comprehensive emergency preparedness networks. The knowledge of how to rapidly mobilize resources and coordinate relief efforts remains theoretical rather than practical. Community resilience stays fragile, built on assumptions rather than the proven strength that comes from surviving actual catastrophe together. You enter newsrooms and media outlets where the national conversation about poverty and race takes dramatically different paths. Without the powerful images of predominantly African American families stranded on rooftops, discussions about structural racism lack emotional urgency. You watch as cable news programs continue their regular political coverage without the weeks of disaster reporting that historically galvanized public opinion. The phrase environmental racism remains academic jargon rather than becoming part of mainstream political vocabulary through tragic example. Congressional Black Caucus members advocate for their communities using statistics rather than the compelling visual evidence of recent suffering. You observe how wealthy white neighborhoods and poor Black neighborhoods maintain their separate realities without disaster revealing the deadly consequences. The federal government's response to racial inequality proceeds at its normal glacial pace without crisis-driven urgency. Social media never explodes with viral images of American citizens abandoned by their government during a life-threatening emergency. You notice how poverty remains an abstract policy issue rather than a concrete matter of life and death survival. The intersection of race, class, and geography in determining disaster vulnerability stays hidden from public consciousness. Civil rights organizations continue their advocacy work without the powerful catalyst that witnessing preventable deaths provides. You realize that America misses a crucial moment for honest national reflection about who gets protected and who gets abandoned. The myth of colorblind disaster response remains unchallenged, with emergency plans that theoretically treat everyone equally. Media coverage of future hurricanes lacks the historical context of how race and class determine survival outcomes. The uncomfortable truths about American inequality remain comfortably buried beneath the surface of national discourse. You enter the laboratories and research institutions where crucial scientific knowledge about hurricanes and flooding advances much more slowly. Storm surge modeling remains primitive without the detailed data that analyzing an actual catastrophic breach would have provided. You watch as atmospheric scientists continue their climate research without the urgency that a recent major disaster brings to funding applications. Flood dynamics studies proceed at academic pace, missing the real-world validation that massive levee failures would have offered. The National Science Foundation allocates hurricane research grants based on theoretical importance, rather than pressing practical needs. You observe how engineering schools continue teaching traditional flood control methods without incorporating lessons from catastrophic system failures. Coastal geology research advances gradually, lacking the intensive investigation that widespread land subsidence damage would have triggered. Computer modeling of extreme weather events remains less sophisticated without the benchmark data from a major urban flooding event. You notice how interdisciplinary disaster research stays fragmented, missing the coordination that analyzing a complex catastrophe would have fostered. Hurricane Hunter aircraft collect routine meteorological data without the enhanced mission focus that studying unprecedented storm impacts creates. The interaction between human infrastructure and natural systems continues being studied in isolation rather than through integrated disaster analysis. You realize that crucial breakthroughs in predicting storm intensification happen years later without the urgent research push. Saltwater intrusion studies proceed slowly, missing the accelerated timeline that widespread flooding contamination would have demanded. Emergency medicine research lacks the critical mass casualties data that would have revolutionized trauma care protocols. The scientific community misses a generation-defining opportunity to understand how natural and human systems interact during extreme stress. You step back to observe how this single avoided disaster crystallizes into a fundamentally different trajectory for American environmental and social policy. The Green New Deal discussions proceed without the visceral evidence of climate vulnerability that waterlogged New Orleans would have provided. You watch as renewable energy transitions happen more gradually, lacking the urgency that energy infrastructure devastation typically creates. Carbon pricing mechanisms face stronger political resistance without recent examples of climate change's economic costs hitting American communities. FEMA's budget remains relatively modest, never receiving the massive expansion that managing a historic disaster would have demanded. You observe how building codes throughout hurricane-prone regions evolve slowly, missing the rapid updates that catastrophic failures usually drive. The National Flood Insurance Program continues its financially unsustainable practices without the crisis that would have forced comprehensive reform. Wetlands restoration receives minimal federal investment, lacking the clear demonstration of how natural barriers protect human communities. You notice how sea level rise adaptation planning remains theoretical rather than becoming an urgent infrastructure priority. Environmental justice movements continue their grassroots organizing without the national platform that disaster-exposed inequality provides. The relationship between urban planning and climate resilience stays academic, never tested by the brutal reality of total system failure. You realize that America's approach to disaster capitalism evolves differently when there's no massive reconstruction economy to exploit. International climate negotiations proceed with less American urgency, missing the diplomatic weight of recent domestic climate impacts. The psychology of national preparedness remains complacent, built on the dangerous assumption that catastrophic events happen to other places. Alternative history crystallizes around this pivotal moment when America avoided learning its most important environmental lesson. You stand at the edge of the next hurricane season, knowing that every structural weakness, every social vulnerability, every system failure remains perfectly intact. The same inadequate levees that would have failed catastrophically during Katrina continue aging and weakening with each passing year. You watch weather forecasters track new storms approaching a city that has learned nothing about its own fragility. Emergency management officials dust off the same flawed evacuation plans that would have trapped thousands in rising floodwaters. The vulnerable populations who should have discovered they lived in death traps remain blissfully unaware in their flood-prone neighborhoods. You observe how the next major hurricane will face the same unprepared infrastructure, The same social inequalities, the same coordination failures. Insurance companies continue writing policies in areas they know will eventually be underwater, confident that the day of reckoning remains distant. Politicians make the same empty promises about infrastructure investment without the urgency that recent catastrophe would have provided. You realize that Mother Nature's audit has been postponed, not canceled, and the bill keeps accumulating interest. The Gulf Coast's vulnerability grows more acute each year as sea levels rise and storms intensify while defenses remain static. Communities from Texas to Florida maintain the same dangerous optimism that historically precedes America's worst natural disasters. You notice how the lessons that should have been written in water and wind remain unlearned, waiting for the next storm to teach them. Climate change continues accelerating while America's largest vulnerable city stays frozen in the same dangerous assumptions. The next category. 3 or higher hurricane approaches a region that missed its chance to learn from near catastrophe. Hurricane seasons arrive with the same false confidence, the same inadequate preparations, the same deadly complacency that defined August 2005. You step back from this alternate timeline and realize how a single storm's path can reshape the entire trajectory of a nation's consciousness. In avoiding Katrina, America postponed its most crucial environmental and social reckonings, letting vulnerabilities compound like interest on an unpaid debt. The lessons written in Rising Water never made it onto the page, leaving future generations to learn them at an even higher cost. You understand now that disasters, for all their horror, sometimes serve as necessary teachers that shake societies from dangerous complacency. New Orleans continued its slow dance with geography and climate, never learning the steps that might have saved lives when the music finally stopped. The intricate web of American inequality remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the next catastrophe to expose its deadly patterns to national scrutiny. Without the shared trauma that forges collective resilience, communities stayed fragmented and vulnerable, their bonds untested by genuine crisis. You realize that this alternate history reveals how much progress sometimes emerges from society's darkest moments of failure and reflection. The next major hurricane to hit an unprepared American city will carry the accumulated weight of all these delayed lessons and deferred investments. Perhaps avoiding one disaster only guaranteed that the next would be even more devastating, the reckoning even more complete. In the end, you understand that Mother Nature doesn't grade on a curve. She simply presents the same test until humanity finally learns to pass it. Here's an interesting question that connects this alternate timeline to our real world. If you could go back and change one moment in recent history to better prepare your own community for future disasters, what would it be and why? What lessons do you think we still need to learn before the next big test arrives?